In our last lecture, I dealt with the period between the death of the Prophet Muhammad and the death of the last of the four righteous caliphs, Ali. As you recall, Ali was murdered, and the new caliph now is the rebel Muawiyah. The year is 661, and in doing so, Muawiyah now begins a new period in the history of Islam. It's the period of the first ever dynasty in Islam, the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty is called the Umayyad dynasty after the name of the family of Muawiyah. So we begin in 661 AD, and the Umayyad dynasty will end in 750. So it's almost around 90 years. Quite short, but very influential. And within this period, we talk about the rise of the Shia. Remember, we left our discussion with a promise to discuss the rise of the Shia, the birth of a new kind of Islam. So in order to understand that, I will need to give you some background regarding the Umayyad dynasty. And in doing so, we will also cover this important period in the history of early Islam. During the Umayyad period, the empire continues to expand and to occupy more and more territories. It expands to Spain. It expands also to Europe. Actually, in the year 732, the Umayyad troops cross the Pyrenees, the mountains between Spain and France, in an attempt to go through into the center and western parts of Europe. However, they were blocked, they were stopped at that occasion in 732 by a French army led by Charles Martel. And that happened in a place called, or near a place called Poitiers. So this is the famous Battle of Poitiers. It's the end of the first attempt of the Muslims to actually break into Western Europe. They will return, they will try, make more attempts in the future, but for now, they are settling in the region that they already conquered. The Umayyad period is also important because of its physical remnants. We find remains of the palaces, for instance, built by the Umayyads in many places, in Iraq, in the Transjordan, and also in the land of Israel. And in Jerusalem, there are several Umayyad Muslim palaces in the land of Israel. One of them is the famous Umayyad palace found in Jericho, today part of the Palestinian Authority. We have found the remains of the palace, the bathhouse, a beautiful mosaic floor, which was recently restored, and it can be seen today. You can visit the site and see it. And beautiful statues from the beginning of Islam. I may perhaps refer the fact that statues are regarded in our modern mind as illegitimate in the world of Islam. We tend to regard Islam as pure monotheism, not allowing the use of statues or any iconographic art, including men, faces of men and animals. However, this is not totally correct, because in the early years of Islam, in the early couple of hundreds of years, statues, paintings were produced in the Islamic world, and they were incorporated into palaces mostly, but certainly never in the mosques or religious buildings. So there was a clear separation between places that were, you could actually use art, iconographic art, and places that you could not. And perhaps we'll relate to that sometime later. In addition, the Umayyads also built a series of palaces, an entire compound of palaces in Jerusalem and next to the Temple Mount. They built 4 palaces, one of them including also a beautiful bathhouse, which was actually a Roman Byzantine bathhouse adopted by the Umayyads and expanded. In addition to that, a palace was built, 2 palaces were built next to the Kinneret, the Lake of Galilee, and so on and so forth. The Umayyad period is also significant because this is the time where we find, we believe, the first traditions about the sanctity of Jerusalem. As we will see later in our lecture on the sanctification of Jerusalem in Islam, the birth of these traditions goes back roughly to the Umayyad period, perhaps even a bit earlier than that. So we're talking about the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th century. From a political and other aspects, we perhaps would like to mention some of the Umayyad caliphs of the time. Muawiyah, who was the first, that's the rebel who took over the empire, ruled from 661 to 680. He established the capital of Islam in Damascus. I'll repeat that later on in my lecture on Jerusalem. It is important to note that even though he could establish his capital in Jerusalem if he only wished to, he chose not to. He chose Damascus. Actually, the Islamic Empire never made Jerusalem its capital throughout the last 1,300 years. It was in different places, in Medina, in Kufa, in Damascus, later in Baghdad, but not in Jerusalem. So the first capital of the Umayyad dynasty is indeed Damascus. The first capital of the Muslims as an empire is in Damascus. The Umayyads also built a navy, which is quite surprising because these people come from the desert and there's definitely no fleet in the desert. However, once they occupy large territories, they realize that if they wish to cope with the mighty power of the Byzantines, for instance, who had a navy, they had to build their own navy. So that also begins in the time of Muawiyah. After the time of Muawiyah, from 680 to 683, I'm going to go through that very briefly because we'd like to focus on the birth of the Shia. We witness a lengthy period of wars between Muslim tribes within the empire in the time of the Caliph Yazid, the son of Muawiyah. It is a time of unrest. And especially, I'd like to mention, and I'll get back to that again sometime later, a rebellion that took place in Mecca against the Umayyads, led by a guy called Abdallah ibn az-Zubayr, who led a mutiny against the Umayyads and gained control for several years over Mecca, the holiest city in Islam. So that had some significance, as we will see later on. But the most famous mutiny, even though the least dangerous of them all, against the Umayyad rule, against Yazid, was the one that was led by a man called Hussein. Now, who was Hussein? Hussein was the son of Ali. Ali, the last caliph, as you recall, who was murdered. His mother was Fatima. Fatima was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. So he was of distinguished origins, the most distinguished origin you may look for in the early Islamic world. And Hussein was naturally, or should have been, the next in line after his father's assassination in 661. Yet, he was kicked aside by the Umayyads. Hussein had a brother. The brother was Hassan. So Hussein and Hassan are actually the potential heirs, the successors of the Islamic leadership. However, as I said, they were pushed aside by the Umayyads. But the Umayyads see them as a threat. So they approach Hassan and ask Hassan to give up his aspirations. In return, he would be compensated. So basically, he was bribed and he agreed not to demand to be the next Caliph ever. That was not a problem The problem was Hussein. Hussein was convinced by his supporters that if he only decided to rebel against the Umayyads, the entire Muslim world will follow him against the Umayyads. So in 680, Hussein leads a very small army. He was leading around, according to some reports, 130 people, or perhaps a couple of hundreds of people, not too many. Many of the members of this expedition were elderly people, young babies, women. So it wasn't a real military campaign. And he met the army of the Umayyads. What happens immediately after is quite stunning. Hussein stands before the army of the Umayyads, and he asks for a free path through the army to another location, to another place. The commander of the Umayyads refused to allow him unless he admits that he is a subject of the Caliph Yazid, which of course Hussein refuses to do. And therefore the battle begins. The little army of Hussein is being attacked by the army of Yazid, and within a relatively short time the battle ends with the death of Hussein. One of the commanders of the Umayyads approaches Hussein, gives him a blow with his sword, and basically cuts off his head. And that was the end of it. No wonder, because there were a couple of thousands of Umayyad soldiers on the other side. So there was no real chance for Hussein to survive the battle. So that was the end of Hussein, and then the winners took his head along with the decapitated heads of the other soldiers that were killed by the Umayyads. They take them to Damascus, to Yazid. Yazid, I guess, is very satisfied with the results. However, at least when he approaches the general public, he expresses his sorrow for the death of Hussein. He says, if I'd been there, I wouldn't have killed him. I would spare him. But of course, that's politics, and we may, of course, be suspicious as to whether that would have been the situation. He got rid of one threat here, and I guess that even though he expressed sorrow, he was actually quite happy to end the story of the dynasty of Ali, or at least that's what he thought. So he made sure that the head of Hussein receives a proper burial in Damascus, which is the capital. But soon enough, he realizes that that was a bad idea. It was a bad idea because the head of Hussein becomes an attraction for the supporters of Ali, his father, and Hussein. The decision was to send the head of Hussein for a reburial somewhere else, somewhere where from a political point of view, it's an insignificant location, so as to prevent the mass pilgrimage to the site. And the place chosen was the land of Israel, which was kind of a backyard of the Muslim empire at the time. It was holy, perhaps, but not significant from a political point of view. So the head was buried again in a place called Ashkelon, on the seashores, the southern seashores of the land of Israel. It will remain there until the Crusaders from Europe, the Christians coming from Europe, will conquer the Holy Land. And then at that point, the head of Hussein will be taken by the Muslims from the burial place in Ashkelon to Egypt, where it was reburied and where it can still be seen, at least the shrine on it can still be seen in the city of Cairo. Mind you, Cairo is a Sunni city, city in a Sunni state in Egypt, yet Hussein, as we will see in a moment, will become the most important, or one of the two most important figures in the other sect, in the Shia. So history has many surprises. Anyhow, the place where Hussein's head was buried is still holy in the Holy Land, in Ashkelon, in Israel, is still holy today. And Shiite Muslims, coming, for instance, from India, would make a pilgrimage to the site where the head of Hussein was buried. Also, the place where it is buried today is a great mosque at the entrance to the great market Khan el-Khalili in Cairo. So the death of Hussein was actually the event that forged, that galvanized the emergence of the new sect or new party in Islam. The followers of Hussein were pushed aside. They believed that he was the only legitimate ruler, that his successors should be the only legitimate rulers, yet they were pushed aside by the Umayyads. So they began to develop their own political identity, but eventually they went on to develop an entirely different kind of religion within Islam. So it's another interpretation to Islam, which is not similar to the mainstream Islam. Being a new party in Islam, or Shia in Islam, Shia means it basically comes from the root denoting a party that split from the main branch of Islam. They are an extremely important power even today in the modern world. But to understand the Shiites, we can't spend just a few minutes. I'd like to spend some time about the religious and theological aspects of the Shia. So let's keep that in mind. I will touch upon that shortly. But meanwhile, I'd like to finish up the series of events that will give us the picture of the early empire, the Umayyad Empire of the Muslims. So we've mentioned two of the caliphs, Muawiyah and Yazid. The next one I'd like to mention is the Caliph Abd al-Malik. And he should be remembered for three reasons, I think. One of them is that during his time, the Dome of the Rock is built in Jerusalem, a memorial that still stands today, a memorial which is also the most ancient monumental building in the Muslim world. It is very important, and we will discuss the Dome of the Rock in the lecture about the sanctification of Jerusalem in Islam that begins to be built exactly in that period. The second thing that we should mention about Abd al-Malik is that during his time, Arabic became the language of administration. Now, this is quite essential to understand that the Muslims created an empire. To run an empire, you need administration. This administration should use some language. Not every language fits for that mission. For instance, Arabic is the language of the relatively primitive tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. There was no empire or any kingdom in the Arabian Peninsula, not a significant political entity before the rise of Islam. And therefore, the Arabs, who were basically Bedouins at the time, did not have any need for terminology that will help them run such an empire. Collecting taxes, military, and so on and so forth, running the economy. So at first, when the Islamic Empire was created, the languages that were used were basically in the western part were Greek, the language of the Byzantine Empire, parts of which were taken by the Muslims. And in the east, it was Persian. But a couple of decades later, now we're in the time of Abd al-Malik, around the year 690, during that time, the Arabic language evolved, and therefore it was now possible to replace the languages of administration with the new language, with Arabic. And Also, I'd like to mention the fact that during the time of Abdul Malik, we see, not for the first time, but now it's becoming the rule, the way things are. We see minting of Islamic coins, not Byzantine coins that were minted, not Persian coins that are used now, but a true series of Islamic coins with verses in Arabic and so on and so forth. So the identity of the empire as an Arabic empire, an Arabic and Muslim empire, begins to forge during these formative years. And if we mention Abdul Malik, I'd like also to mention his son, Al-Walid I. There was another one later. So Al-Walid I, he rules from 705 to 715, and he replaces his father. During the time of Al-Walid I, the Umayyad Empire continues to expand. They also occupy Spain. One location they take over in 711 is a mountainous area which was taken by General Tariq. So it was known from that point on as Jabal Tariq. Jabal means a mountain, Tariq is the name, Jabal Tariq, and that was corrupted later into Gibraltar. So Gibraltar was taken also by the Umayyads, along with Spain, northwest India. They invaded the northwest India too. Now, the occupation of Spain is extremely important from a historical perspective, because when the Umayyad dynasty falls eventually in 750, one of the members of the royal family will go to Spain, and he will establish a little Umayyad dynasty in Spain. So the presence of the Muslims in Spain will continue even after the fall of the Umayyad dynasty in different ways. Until when? Until 1492. 1492. So Muslims will be present in the region of Spain for the next hundreds of years. The reason for the end of the Islamic presence in Spain is that at some point the Christians in Spain will rebel against the oppressors, against the Muslims, and begin to regain control over the land, kicking out gradually, pushing out the Muslims. This process is called the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain by Christianity, but it would last for hundreds and hundreds of years. Al-Walid should also be remembered for building a new city in the land of Israel, or in the Holy Land. This city is Ramle, a new local capital. When the Muslims conquered the Holy Land, they actually didn't build too many cities. But the first of them was Ramle, which was established by the Muslims in around the year 705 to 715, around that time, as a local capital of a region in the area. Al-Walid also builds a mosque on the Temple Mount. I will refer to that mosque also when we discuss the sanctification of Jerusalem, but just allow me to mention the name of the mosque. It's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's extremely important, and we'll address that building and its significance later. So we discussed some of the events that happened during the Umayyad period. And I'd like to elaborate a little bit about the social, religious aspects of the Umayyad Empire. Remember, when the Arabs come from the Arabian Peninsula, we're talking about a relatively small number, couple of tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people. There are different estimations. None of them is, of course, historically accurate. We don't know much about that period. But they conquer a world stretching from, as I said, from Spain to Egypt to Syria, parts of other sections such as Turkey and so on and so forth. And all these areas, all these territories are inhabited by either Christians or Sassanid Persians, that is Zoroastrian pagans, or different other religions. And the question is, how did Islam manage to subjugate all these populations to Islam? How did they all become Muslim? It's an interesting question. I'm going to address that very briefly, but the point was that we first need to emphasize the difference between Islamization and Arabization. When we speak about Islamization, it's simple. We talk about people accepting, receiving the new religion and becoming Muslims. When we talk about Arabization, it means adopting the Arabic culture in general, not necessarily the religion. It's a cultural thing. For instance, if you are being an Arab, if you become part of the Arab culture, then you'd adopt the Arab attire, the way they dress. You'd adopt the language. You'll adopt the calendar, and so on and so forth, but not necessarily their religion. So we have Christian Arabs, Jewish Arabs, under the general rule of the Islamic Arab control. The Islamization is more difficult. To impose a new religion is quite difficult. Usually, actually, the process is the opposite. The majority would impose its own religion. It will infiltrate the conquerors, and they will become perhaps closer to the majority of the people who are not Christian, who are not Muslim. What happened here was quite ingenious. The Muslims actually established cities, new cities. They call them Amsar. Misr or Masr is a city. One of them would be the city of Kufa in Iraq. Another one was Fustat, a new city that was established in Egypt, and there were others. These cities were military cities, and the troops of the Muslims, who are already Muslims, settled there. At that point, they would allow traders, people who wish to benefit from the Muslim rulers' fortune, to trade with them. They would allow them to settle around, but only if they agree to become Muslims, if they convert. And if they don't, then they're not allowed. And that created actually a kind of a core of Islamic religion, around which there were kind of rings of settlement, much, much larger than the Islamic core, who were willing to convert to Islam. In that way, they actually radiated Islam into the surrounding world around them. So that was the beginning of a process. Obviously, it's not enough, and it took hundreds of years before the Islamization of many parts of the Middle East was actually completed. In Jerusalem, for instance, in the 10th century, there's one Muslim scholar who complains that he sees too many Christians in the city. And now we're in the 10th century. That's hundreds of years after the occupation of the land by the Muslims. So it's not a process that took place in 1 or 2 decades, but rather in hundreds of years. The people who joined Islam, some of them were Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula. That was in the beginning. Others were people from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Syria, from Egypt. They were not Arabs. Arabs, ethnically speaking, are those Bedouins who came from the Arabian Peninsula. Today we use the term Arab loosely to denote those who speak Arabic, but that's incorrect. In antiquity, the Arabs were a definite ethnic group. So those who joined Islam in other territories are not Arabs, but they're Muslims. They believe that once they become Muslims, they will be equal to the Arabs. Yet they were quite disappointed to find that they were definitely not. So basically, if you were an Arab, you had all the benefits and you could enjoy being part of the empire. But if you weren't an Arab, your conditions were not much better than the conditions of a non-Muslim. And so these people felt that they are being maltreated, that they're being treated like non-Arabs, and that perhaps they would be better off remaining in their own original religion. They begin to grow sentiments, anti-Arab sentiments, anti-Umayyad sentiments. These people, the new people who joined Islam, who are so frustrated at this point, are called in Arabic the Mawali. Mawali means the companions. They're not treated like real Arabs. So we have here a growing number of dissatisfied people in the 8th century during the Umayyad rule. In addition to that, there's another group, which is, of course, by definition, dissatisfied. And this is, of course, these are, of course, the followers of Ali and his son Hussein. These are what we call the Shiites. So there's another dissatisfaction, a group of dissatisfied people in the Islamic world. And it's just, I may compare it to a barrel full of gunpowder. It just needs a spark. It needs someone to take advantage of these sentiments to lead a rebellion against the Umayyads. And indeed, there's a family called the Abbasid family. They are the opponents of the Umayyads, and they make good use of this opportunity, leading all the dissatisfied groups into war with the Umayyads, and basically bringing an end to the existence of the Umayyad dynasty in the year 750. It is an earthquake, literally an earthquake, you see, because what I'm talking about is a political earthquake, the end of the first dynasty in Islam and the rise of another dynasty called the Abbasids. But it's also the time when a real earthquake struck the entire land. And that earthquake took place, according to some scholars, in 749. The remains or the effects of this earthquake can be seen all over the Holy Land, the land of Israel. But the real story, of course, is the political earthquake, the end of the Umayyad dynasty. And as we could see, a major role in the process that led to the demise of the Umayyad dynasty was played by the Shiites, along with others. So let me now take the opportunity to explain what the Shiites believe in.